Today, let's make an extra sturdy string satchel on a bulky machine. I will be using this yarn. I get it from Country Knitting of Maine. It's Conshohocken softball cotton, the 0.75 weight. Other worsted weight cotton yarn will do. You could use the one we most recently used to make the Curvaceous Easy VT. This is called Premier Home Cotton. As a matter of fact, for the photo of the bag that we're going to make, I stuffed 5 of the big 11-ounce balls into the bag to give you an idea of its size. This pattern is not especially fussy about either yarn or gauge, and it doesn't even really have to be cotton yarn, although that's traditional. This is a variation of the String Satchels for All pattern found in my Great Knitted Gifts Volumes 1 and 2 book. That's a 2-book composite now sold together. The arrow is pointing to the picture of the pattern on the cover, and in the book, it's for all gauges of machine in many sizes. Here's the table of contents for Volume 1 of the book. Here is the cover of Volume 2 and the table of contents for Volume 2. The two are sold bundled together and are 84 pages. I'll put a link in the program notes. The collections are based on my idea that a great knitted gift is one that doesn't require an enormous investment, that fits a lot of people without fuss, and has wide appeal. Since a string satchel can be a shopping bag, a toy bin, a beach bag, and any number of other things, I think it fits the bill. So find a suitable yarn, equip yourself with bobby pins, and we'll get started on any bulky machine at all. I'm demonstrating on a Knit Smart machine, which is my very most basic machine, using key plate 35. The Knit Smart is almost identical to a bond, so you will be included in the instructions, bond knitters, and I think key plate 3 dot would be ideal if you have one, but 3 or 4 will do. Using any other bulky machine, my Brother 260, my Singer 150, I would use between stitch size 6 and 7. Also the LK100 and the HK100, same general range, possibly 8 for the HK100. As to knitting the design on the mid gauge, not with the yarn I'm demonstrating with, but if you use the Premier Home Cotton, that does in fact knit okay at about stitch size 8. Use the hem, comb, or weights or combination appropriate to your machine. Cast on and waste yarn across 31 needles using any method. Knit several rows of waste, 1 row of ravel cord, and then begin the real cast on double E-wrap across the entire span of the work. That means making the cursive letter E around 2 forward needles, bringing the yarn back over, laying it in the open hook of the first needle, and manually pulling back a stitch. If you need more help than this, I do have an entire video on cast-ons. The next little bit is the part that differentiates the pattern I'm showing you from the one in the book. We want to knit 7 plain rows for a hem. So here you saw me just finish up the cast on and try to begin knitting the 7 rows. This would work great if this were one of my metal bed machines. So if you're working on a metal bed machine, just knit 7 rows now at the main stitch size. Bond and Knit Smart knitters, you may have happen what you saw happen to me. This is a bumpy yarn and the machine did not want to knit it back from the cast on. That's okay. Manually knit the first of the 7 rows by placing the yarn in the needle hook and pulling back to form a stitch yourself. Then move the carriage to the side where the working yarn is, thread it back, and everything should be fine from here on out. Just go ahead and knit 6 more rows. You've already manually knitted the first. These 7 rows create a hem through which we will eventually insert the handles. It's best to remove some or all of the weights for this next step, because we're going to hang the cast on in order to close the hem. Move across the work, picking up a single strand of yarn from each stitch of the cast on. We only want a single strand because that's plenty strong in a yarn like this, and hanging more on the needles makes the next row very difficult for the machine. So work around until you find a single strand from each cast on stitch and hang each strand on a separate needle. Here I made a mistake and I'm having to go back and fix it, and I'm leaving it in because it could happen to you. I was concentrating so much on showing off picking up my strand that I allowed the work to ride up and the original stitch to pop off the needle, so I have to fix it. I know from experience the machine won't want to knit this row, so I'm going through the usual process to move the carriage to the other side and manually knit the row. On metal bed machines and quite a few plastic machines, just not this one, you can knit the row with the carriage. The next step is very important and very simple. You must begin with stitch number 2 from one edge and transfer that stitch to the next needle over. Do the same with every other stitch across the entire bed. We are creating a row of eyelets. The positioning of the eyelets is integral to the design. We now need to knit one plain row, and again there are 2 stitches on some needles, which is a bit of a challenge for the machine. So if this were a fancier machine, I would knit back from hold. Being as it's not, I'm opening all the latches, which you don't have to do with a fancier machine, and then pushing back the needles to upper working position, which does half of the work of knitting the row for them and will make it easier on the carriage to knit this row. Success! So now get out your trusty bobby pins. These are a drugstore item, and on the working yarn, hang one. Hang it as close as you possibly can to the actual knitting. Hang that bobby pin on the working yarn, then knit across, and we will repeat this action as many times as we are going to knit rows down one side of the bag. I knitted 30 rows for this sample, so 15 pins on each side. A nifty thing about this technique is that you don't truly have to count because the bobby pins are counting for you. At any time, you can double check how many have been hung, and that's how many rows you've knitted. A word of caution, don't overdo the length. The bag will grow when we drop stitches, which we're about to do, and it will grow again in length when we load it with our goodies. Now, beginning with stitch number 2 on one edge of the work, drop every other stitch, but leave the empties and work. The dropped stitches will, of course, begin to run. That's actually what we want. We are going to resume knitting on all needles now, and those runs will eventually stop where we created the eyelets. That's why the positioning of the eyelets is so important. So we're going to resume knitting, and for this machine I need to make sure I open all the latches and then return the needles to upper working position. For most other kinds of machines, you can simply resume knitting. And now we're going to knit 2 rows still hanging bobby pins. On the first of these 2 rows, all of the needles that we just emptied should pick up and begin knitting again. So check and make sure that happened. Hang 1 bobby pin on the side with the carriage, knit across, hang another one on the side the carriage is now on, and that's it for the bobby pins. After this, we begin to use the bobby pins for their intended purpose. What they are is a combination of a handle and a stitch marker. Everywhere that one appears, it's caught in an edge stitch from one of the rows that was knitted, and we pick them up in order, hang that edge stitch on the end needle, and knit across. What this is a foolproof method of working a sew-as-you-go seam up each side of the fabric. The process is, before knitting each row, go to the side away from the carriage, lift the top bobby pin and the stitch it's holding, hang that stitch on the needle, and knit across. Here you saw me put the needle into upper working position because that makes it a little bit easier on the carriage to knit off. We'll be doing this all the way up the second side of the bag. However, after the first 2 rows, take a brief pause and make another row of eyelets, just as the last one was made, also beginning on stitch number 2, counting from one edge. It's super important that the eyelets always occur on the same needles because they will stop the runs that we're making on purpose. After creating the row of eyelets, prepare to knit them back so that all needles resume knitting in whatever manner has been working for you. On this machine, I always open all the latches, bring the needles forward, then push them back to upper working position, and then we resume the process of hanging one stitch lifted by one bobby pin opposite the carriage, each row for 30 rows. Remove each bobby pin after it's done its job of lifting the stitch and set it aside. Very likely you will need to keep moving the weights up, but watch what's happening to me here. My weighted comb is in the way of me hanging the edge stitch. While knitting the first side, moving my comb up frequently on the front of the work and having it span the entire width of the work was not a problem because we were knitting straight down. But now we are forming a pouch, so the comb keeps ending up inside of that pouch. And you have a couple of choices. Either keep moving it up, but not quite as far as I did in the first example, about a ½ inch below the top, and you will be able to access the pins and the fabric and the needles in order to hang properly. Or move the comb to the back of the work, reach around behind it, and hang the comb from that side. By the way, the combs that you see me using came from my HK 100 machine. They did not come with this machine, but something very similar is now sold at the Chris Crafter website, and they are excellent. This style is something that came with a lot of Singer Studio hobby machines, and of course that's what the HK 100 is. Because of the pouch forming, it is possible that some of the stitches can get loose on the needles, and then they'll want to drop off. So keep an eye out for that possibility and have a collection of claw weights handy to hang across in any loose spots. After the final stitch held on a bobby pin is hung, knit across one time, then drop the stitches from every needle where an eyelet was made. It should be fine to drop beginning at either end because we're using an odd number of stitches and it should come out the same way, whether you begin at the left or the right. So at this point, we have knitted both sides of the bag and we have completed seaming them together. Those stitches will begin to run and that's fine. Now we need to knit the second hem. It's actually one side of the top. To do that, begin with a separate piece of main yarn and cast on again around all the working needles. Half of the needles still have stitches on them, that's fine. Half of them are empty because we just emptied them, and that's fine. This cast on will allow us to make a finished second hem. Complete the cast on all the way across the work. When the new cast on is complete, knit 7 plain rows, then stop knitting and lift one strand of yarn from the cast on onto each working needle. This closes the second hem, so we can now bind off. Here I'm using the transfer method and just my fingers, although of course you can use a tool to do it. It's easier for me to keep my hands out of the way of your view of what's going on using fingertips, but a tool to move the stitch is the more traditional way. All we have to do now to complete the bag is pull out the ravel cord so as to separate the waste yarn from the main knitting. And for ravel cord, I just used a stray strand of ordinary yarn, so it's not pulling out in one piece, but I don't mind doing it a little along. Give each hem a lengthwise tug so that the stitches assume their correct shape, and then purposely pull down on each side of the fabric so that the stitches we dropped run to the eyelets we made. And this is creating the net fabric, but in a controlled way. Depending on the yarn, you may have to put a little muscle into the stretching. Here are the stitches running till they bump into the eyelets, and then they stop. Now we must weave in the ends, and the best places are the sew-as-you-go seams where the fabric is firm, and the hems at two ends where the fabric is firm. Does not work well, of course, to weave it into the open work net fabric. You can use the same yarn or a contrasting yarn for the handle. Cast on 6 stitches and knit to whatever length you like. I knitted 110 rows. Use a big yarn needle or a safety pin to help you thread the string through both of the casings. Sew the ends of the handle that I referred to as the string together, and then move it around so that where they're sewn together is hidden inside the casing. And that's it. Your extra sturdy string satchel is complete.